You and I are the whole point. This is part 2 of exploring the pearl at the center of John's prologue, the astounding reality that the divine life is meant to be shared. We, you and I, invited to share the divine DNA. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. In my head, I hear a voice saying, "Previously on," and in my mind's eye, I see the skip recap button on my screen. And sometimes if you click that, you don't actually skip the entire recap. What you often get is the last few seconds of the prior episode, typically a climactic moment of suspense that sets you up for what you're about to see. In this case, the last bit of the recap of the last episode would have ended something like this. We are also invited to see, know, believe, receive, and become God's children, divine children. We've come to verse 13 of John 1, which is the second of two verses which form the pearl at the heart of verses 1 to 18. Verse 12 mentions the possibility of becoming God's children, indeed mentions not only the possibility, but says that at least some people have become children of God. Verse 13 will take us further into the depths of what that means for John. And to start, it seems good to refresh our memory of both verse 12 and 13 together, so here they are again. And yet, to as many of those who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. They're not children related by blood. They are not conceived by natural human desire. They are not conceived as a result of a husband's will. They are children begotten by God. This episode is devoted entirely to unpacking what John means and some of what he does not mean by that phrase, children begotten by God. And I want to set the stage for that by outlining some of the background to the idea, a background that sets the context for how John, the author and the original audience for whom he wrote, could have processed the meaning of the words begotten and children of God. There are actually two worldviews that might have provided the context for how John's audiences would have processed these ideas of divine offspring. First, within the broader Greco-Roman world of John's time, there was a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses who procreated among themselves and with humans, and they produced many sons and daughters as a result. At what we might call the popular level, there were people who took such mythical narratives quite literally. There were also those who took the stories and figures in something of a symbolic or kind of analogical sense, mythic but not meaningless. And that would not have been John's primary set of ideas, nor that of most of his primary audience, but these were ideas that some readers of his day who might have come across his work would have brought to their reading of the text. John and his primary audience shared a whole different set of assumptions about the concept of begetting and of being God's children. In the context of the Hebrew sacred texts, which formed John's spiritual heritage, there are 4 references to divine offspring that seem especially applicable here, as they are references that are not used in a pejorative or critical sense. First of those is spiritual beings. Deuteronomy 32 uses the phrase sons of God to most likely refer to a divine council of angelic beings, to each of whom, it seems, God assigned, according to Deuteronomy, various nations, giving them some measure of authority or responsibility for them. And then a second use is related to nature. In Psalm 90, verse 2, we read that before the mountains were begotten, or you, God, gave birth to the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. The term I rendered here as begotten is the Hebrew word yalad, to beget. And the phrase I rendered gave birth means literally bring forth. In this case, it's a parallel to begat, and so it's best taken as referring to the culmination of the labor process, in the birthing process. God begat and birthed the creation. It's a poetic way of saying that creation is God's offspring here. Then there's Israel. There are three references to the nation or people of Israel as God's son that I want to refer to here. First, in Exodus chapter 4, God refers to Israel as the divine firstborn son, compared to, say, Pharaoh's firstborn or the firstborn children of the Egyptians. In Hosea 11, referring to the events of the Exodus, Hosea cites God as saying, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And the third reference I want to point to here is in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 18 says that God was the rock that begat the people of Israel. The word is the same one we've noted about nature just a moment ago, yalad in Hebrew, to beget or to conceive. And then I also want to mention the way that the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures refer to the kings of Israel. This is a final element in this background look at predecessors of John's idea of divine children. And in the Hebrew scriptures, we're told that it's the kings of Israel who were said to be God's sons, begotten by God. So, for example, Psalm 2, verse 7, "He, God, said to me," the writer says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Some translations render that as, "Today I've become your father." But the Hebrew term is again yalad, to beget. Now, other than the reference in Psalm 90 to creation as begotten by God, all the references so far speak of special people or special beings as divine children. The divine council is collectively referred to as God's sons. Only Israel among all the nations is said to be God's son, and the only individuals within Israel said to be begotten by God were the kings of Israel. And of course, a similar point could be made about the Greco-Roman mythologies. It's not all humans that are conceived by the gods. It's just a rare few. Now, before looking at John's way of seeing all of that, there's another set of ideas about divine sonship that I want to mention here. It's one that John and at least some of John's audiences may have been aware of. Within the emerging movement, centered in various ways on the person of Jesus, the communities which came into being through the work of the man who came to be known as the Apostle Paul would have been familiar with the idea of God's children and vocabulary about that, because Paul spoke of being God's children, although his preferred vocabulary is not that of begetting, but of adoption, and thus the granting of a legal status with certain privileges. It's the idea of being like God's children or treated as if God's children. The idea is found both in the early and later writings of Paul, so it's prevalent throughout his thinking, the letters of Galatians and Romans and Ephesians. Now, Paul does have ways of speaking of a spiritual transformation that is more than the mere conferring of a status, an as if, that I've mentioned just a moment ago, through adoption. Paul also spoke of ways that humans can share the character of God, partake in some way in God's life and nature. As we will see, some of Paul's ideas about this could seem similar to John. However, for Paul, this sort of transformation is possible through the Spirit. He doesn't speak of the idea of being begotten as God's children to convey the way that we might share in the divine nature in the way, as we will see, that John describes it. John is saying something different than the Greco-Roman world said, something different from his own sacred heritage in the Hebrew sacred texts, and something different than his contemporary in the growing, diverse Jesus movement, Paul, might have said. According to John, we become children of God by being begotten. Now, what does it mean to be begotten by God? John begins by making three contrasts, in a way saying what it doesn't mean. As he puts it, they're not children by blood, not conceived by natural human desire, and not conceived as a result of a husband's will, but rather children begotten by God. So there's five major points that I want to draw out here. First, not of blood. Actually, literally not of bloods, plural. The use of a plural here has led some commentators to suggest that John might be referring to the sexual coupling of a man and a woman, and pardon the indelicacy here, the mingling of their bodily fluids. One problem with that interpretation, of course, is that blood is not the fluid that the couple is sharing in that instance, and so the plural doesn't really fit, at least not the plural bloods. The other major interpretation of this phrase is that bloods here means that something like today we would call DNA, like the bloodline. And the main objection that some might raise to that interpretation is that John's use of the plural bloods seems an unusual way to refer to one's ancestral descent. However, if we keep in mind that the two bloodlines are in fact combined in conception, bloods as bloodline or bloodlines plural would make perfect sense. Now, I can imagine John interjecting here and saying, yeah, but you're kind of missing the whole point. The point isn't whether I meant bloodlines or sex. The whole point is the word not. In other words, either way, the meaning is that being a child of God does not depend on one's ancestry, however that might get spoken about. And so more specifically within John's heritage, and contra to what we saw in Exodus 4 and Hosea 11, having Hebrew blood and ancestry is not the path to being children of God. The next phrase is not from the will of the flesh, not from the natural will of the sarx, that word again that we've seen in prior episodes to refer to creation as well as sort of human nature in general. Now, some translations render this as the desire of the flesh. I prefer to translate the term as will here because desire took on the very narrow negative implications of sexual desire in much of Christian history. John could have used a term that would have had those connotations, but he selects a rather matter-of-fact, normal term for will or purpose or want. And there's nothing here to suggest that humans wanting sexual intimacy in this way is anything negative for John. John's main point here, again, because I don't want him interjecting to say we're missing the point, is that we don't become God's children through this. And then there's the third expression, neither the will of a husband, as I've rendered it. John is putting essentially the same point here in yet a third way. It's not through the will of a man, or again, as I've put it, husband, that this happens. Now, I translated the term husband because if John wanted to refer generally to humans, not through the will of a human being or human beings, he had the term ἀνθρώπος available. He uses, however, the Greek word andros, and andros is more specifically signaling the male figure involved in procreation. And in context, this would have signaled a husband. The same neutral term for will or desire is used again, as in the phrase we just looked at. So again, nothing negative implied here whatsoever. And the net result is that John has now stacked up three different ways by which we do not become God's children. And I think he does this in order to emphasize a main point that's sort of a simple point, setting up a contrast. It's not by this, it's not by that, it's not by this, leading the reader to expect a but, and that is indeed what John gives us. But John uses the strongest option available to him, Allah, to express a contrast in Greek. It's a sharp but, more like but rather, more like but on the contrary, begging the question, of course, well, if it's not by bloodline and not by human will or natural will and not by the will of a husband, then how does one become a child of God? which brings us back to the center, and in fact, to what I would call the center of the center, the pearl at the middle of the pearl. Having been begotten of God, or begotten of God. Let's recall the prior description of the whole background for this word in John's heritage. John is telling us here that it's not just those who are unique offspring, like the couplings of the Greco-Roman gods. In fact, that may not even have been in his mind. It's not a special people or nation, which would have been in his mind, the people of Israel. It's not just the kings of Israel. And it's not just angelic beings who can be said to have been begotten by God, or children of God, and thus be seen as divine children. John is saying much more than that we have a chance to be adopted by God's children. That's kind of an awkward sentence there. He's saying more than just we have a chance to be adopted and treated as if. John's making the claim that everyday normal people, potentially everyone and anyone, you and I, can be divine children. Again, not just treated as if we're children of God, not just loved as if or like we are God's children, but begotten, and thus truly divine children. Divine? To be begotten means to share DNA. And so, no, it is not a stretch to speak here of being divine children. And the term is fitting in two ways, I think, for John. First, it refers to those who are children of the divine, as in the divine is their source. They're the divine being is the source of their being divine children. And second, it's referring to those who share the divine character, the family resemblance of God, God as their nature or character. In other words, to speak of being begotten by God means that children are children of the divine and children who are divine. Now, I'm not saying that they're gods or God. So what am I saying? Or rather, what is it that I think John is saying? And my answer takes us back to the opening rings that we've looked at already from John 1 to 18. John has woven these rings together around this central pearl to make the point that everything so far said about the nature of God in verses 1 to 18 is descriptive of those who are begotten. In other words, what we noted about the divine character, the into-ness, the towardsness, the embrace, the openness, and the humility that John has revealed as the divine nature is the DNA passed on to the divine children whom God begets. That's the sense in which human beings can be said to be divine, sharing that divine nature. But this raises a question for me to ask of John, or really two questions. Who is or can be divine children, and how? Questions are related, of course, because, how does this begetting take place, and then who has in fact been together are related questions. The how leads to the who asks about the how. So let me start with those questions, and I'm going to take up how first. How? Divine initiative. To speak of begetting is to emphasize the divine initiative. I had no role to play in my conception. That was all the work of my parents, and that's the first and perhaps primary emphasis for John. And this point fits with things he writes elsewhere in the gospel. God begets, God takes the initiative. And so that's one aspect of the how. But there's also how in terms of human response. However, we've already seen John describes these human responses. There's nothing new here. For John, human response does have a role to play, even though the divine initiative is crucial. And in prior episodes, I noticed that those responses included knowing, receiving, seeing, and believing. But knowing, receiving, seeing, believing whom or what? Well, God is the short answer. The God who is the Word that is towards God, which is the universal light which illumines every person, which came into the world and was in the world and became flesh and lived among humans, knowing, receiving, seeing, believing, all of this, or all of them, is the response or responses to the divine initiative or initiatives that leads to being begotten. And in fact, both are best described as plural, divine initiatives and human responses. Divine initiatives in John 1, as we've seen, include bringing the cosmos into being, having life in God's self, or bringing life into being in God's own self, which is the light of all humanity. It's the light that illuminates all people and each person. That's divine initiative. It's the light being in the world and coming into the world. That's divine initiative. Becoming flesh and dwelling among us. That's the divine initiative. Doing that as the only unique God who is towards God and in the bosom of God, bringing God out, God's initiative. And finally, taking the initiative in begetting us as divine children. Human responses, as we've seen and as I've just mentioned, include knowing, that is, recognizing, perceiving, and experiencing this. That's a response. Receiving it, taking it in, welcoming it, giving all this a home in ourselves. That's a human response. Seeing it, not just in it happen to come across our path, but paying attention, meditating on, looking at. It's a human response. And then believing, not just mental assent, as in, 1 + 1 = 2, but actually trusting, relying upon, resting oneself on this. It's the combination or interplay of these divine initiatives and these human responses that I believe answers the question of how people might become begotten as divine children, which in turn answers the question, who? This is how, and who is it? Well, it's those who do the how, who know, receive, see, and believe. The who is whoever responds. Now here I feel I need to address a point of view about all of this that is the prevailing way that the Christian world understands John 1, namely that knowing, receiving, seeing, and believing not only involves Jesus, but is exclusively related to Jesus, the Jesus that lived at a certain period of time and about whom we might know certain things. That is, that the humans who can be said to be God's children are the humans who respond in certain ways. Not only those who respond in certain ways, but who respond to certain facts and ideas concerning specifically Jesus. Now, what John has to say about all this certainly includes his understanding of who Jesus was and is, his ideas about the specific human being, Jesus. After all, as we've seen, according to John, there's a way in which the Word became flesh uniquely and specifically in that person, Jesus. However, what John wants us to see about all this is something I'm going to express in a sort of strange statement. He wants us to see that something bigger took place in Jesus than what took place in Jesus. I know that's a strange way to put it, but what John wants us to see in Jesus is something bigger than the specific human being of the first century of the Common Era. Long before the Word took flesh and became present in Jesus, the Word was already present, John has said in chapter 1. The Word that took flesh in Jesus is also the light that is the light of all humans, and that light shines for each human. As such, the human responses to all of the divine initiatives include responses to the way the Word became flesh in Jesus, but are not limited to that. Obviously, given that no one before the time of Jesus, and not nearly everyone since the time of Jesus, and only a tiny percentage of humans alive during the time of Jesus ever encountered the Word and light in and through Jesus, then if the only way to be begotten as God's children was based on one's response to Jesus, then very, very few ever had a chance, or ever will have a chance, to be so. However, John 1 shows us that all human beings, and each human being, everywhere and always, are invited to respond to the light that shines everywhere and always for each human being. The human responses to the divine initiatives Our response is to God, who is the Word and the light. Whether one knows and receives and sees and believes that light in its particular or in its general presence, in the person of Jesus or in the universe as the light of all humanity. The fact that John affirms a specific and particular revelation of the light in the person of Jesus did not and does not cancel the universal availability of the light prior to, during, and after the quote-unquote Jesus event. At this point, I want to circle back to something from the prior episode related to the fact that we're referred to as children with the Greek term tekna, while only Jesus is called huios, son. I mentioned that some take this to mean that John is making a really sharp distinction between us as children and Jesus as son. And there is a distinction. But the uniqueness is also about us. It goes both ways. Here's what I mean. It's true that in John, we are never called huioi, or sons, plural, and only Jesus is a huios, or son, singular. At the same time, John never says that Jesus is begotten. That's a statement only made about human beings who respond in certain ways to the light, a point I will return to in a few moments. But I think here it's important to note that even though Jesus is never referred to as begotten, it doesn't mean that he wasn't. And even though we're never referred to with the same term huioi, plural sons, as Jesus is, it doesn't mean we aren't. John is trying to point out the distinctions in a different way. Now, there's another common misunderstanding relative to John's use of the term begotten, which has to do with the expression born again. And this is a phrase very common in certain Christian circles, especially in the evangelical Protestant Christian world. And it is, I believe, quite misunderstood. In fact, it's odd to me that this expression, born again, became so important in certain Christian circles. I say that because the phrase often translated born again is found only in John chapter 3, nowhere else in John, and nowhere else in the entire New Testament for that matter. The phrase is a combination of two words, the word for begetting, genao, and the word anothen, which can mean a range of things. It can refer to something that has happened again, and can also refer to something that happened or came from above. So how does John use it? Is it born again or born from above? And context is everything. So here's the context. In John 3, where this phrase is used, John reports a conversation between Jesus and a man named Nicodemus, in which Jesus says that unless a person is genethe anothen, begotten either from above or again, they cannot enter the quote-unquote kingdom, which was a way of speaking of the new life and new community that Jesus was bringing. And Nicodemus asks how this is possible. He asks it because he seems to believe that Jesus means unless one is begotten anothen, in other words, again, literally, they can't see the kingdom. So Nicodemus asks Jesus, how can someone go back into the womb to be born a second time? And Jesus' entire explanation to Nicodemus is reported by John. It's reported by John, is aimed at clarifying that he does not mean again, and that he's not speaking of birth and conception in any normal human sense, but rather that he means from above. In other words, divine initiative. John's reporting Jesus saying that humans can be begotten in the way we've seen John describe it in verses 12 and 13 of John 1. Not from blood, not from human conception, but by divine initiative. And I want to return to the question of how one becomes a child begotten by God, and specifically to the human responses involved. The four main responses to the light word God that we've been looking at all assume a process. Here's what I think John is showing us about our responses, which have a part in being begotten as God's children. In John 1, the light shines everywhere for everyone, as we've seen. It's in the world in such a way that we and everyone, each of us, can know and recognize it. However, seeing and knowing unfold in layers in John's story. They're not once and done. Throughout the Gospel of John, even Jesus' own disciples see various events and signs and hear various things, but only later really come to understand and fully grasp things. It's a process. As people see and begin to grasp things, they receive and welcome and take them into themselves. They take in those things that they see and know. And in so doing, they come to believe. And that word believe is used in John to refer to far more than just accepting certain ideas as if they're true. It speaks of a profound trust and an entrustment, as when in John 2 we're told that many believed in Jesus based on seeing signs he performed, but that he did not believe himself to them. Same word is used for they believed in him, but he didn't believe himself to them. In other words, didn't entrust himself, because he knew their belief was not fully formed and was not trust, but just mere assent to certain ideas based on various miraculous events, just the surface level of things. In addition, John makes it clear in chapter 3 of the same gospel that responding to the light means being willing to come to the light, which means a willingness to be seen and to have our own darker shadows brought into the light and revealed and seen. Seen by us, seen by God, presumably seen by others. To see the light that shines, to know the light that is in the world, to receive and welcome that light more and more fully, and to grow in believing, trusting in, and relying on the light that one has seen, known, and received. That all of that means being willing to be seen and to be transparent. All of that is the process, according to John, that leads to more than a new way of living and seeing the world. It leads to being a new being. It leads to being a new being, a being that has been begotten as a divine child. To be begotten by God as divine children isn't just referring to the point in time when one exits the womb, and it's not referring to a point in time when one believes a certain thing. It's akin to the whole process of conception, pregnancy, formation in the womb, and birth. The spiritual reality of being begotten is like that process. Now, that doesn't diminish the place that Jesus holds in all of this for John. Jesus is a unique and, we might say, concrete or quite literally embodied expression of the way the Word and light are universally present and available. But again, neither does that specificity negate or diminish the universal availability and reality of the light for all to know and see and receive and believe. Now, I want to do some concluding and some summing up here. It's taken me multiple episodes and many thousands of words in English to try to explain what John said in about 250 Greek words in verses 1 through 18 of chapter 1. And yet I still don't feel confident that I've adequately expressed the astounding reality at the heart of the central pearl of this first chapter of John. But having said that, let me try to summarize it here again. That we can become sharers of the divine DNA, begotten by God as divine children. That's the main point of these 18 verses that I've been looking at. But that pearl is set within a whole world, a world in which the DNA, the nature of the divine being, is revealed as towards and into, embracing, open, humble. For John, the world is aglow with divine light. It's a world in which there are divine and human witnesses to the light, a world that's been inhabited by God generally and universally. The light was in the world, we're told, and very specifically, the Word became flesh in a person named Jesus. It's a world in which we're given an invitation to the process of seeing, knowing, receiving, and trusting, a process that results in our transformation. And that transformation brings me back to the central, astounding, astonishing point of John, that we can become sharers of the divine DNA, begotten by God as divine children, reflecting those qualities of the divine DNA: towardsness, intoness, embrace, openness, and humility. Imagine for a moment a world in which human beings were like that. Imagine your life if you were like that. And yes, Kevin, imagine your life if you were truly like that. I've made references several times to the fact that there's a lot of implications from the various points I've made from John chapter 1, implications for other areas of interest and importance, art and religion, Christianity, yes, but the whole nature of religion as John might see it, human nature, and much more. And I do want to take all of that up, but I also want to just give myself space to pause as soon as I'm done recording, and invite you to pause as you're listening, to just imagine that world in which we might be human beings who are marked by towardsness, intoness, embrace, openness, and humility. Imagine a world like that. Imagine a you like that. Kevin, imagine a me like that. All right, well, I'll be taking up some of these implications for some of these other areas that really interest me, and I hope interest you. Implications that I think are important to reflect upon. But I'll do all of that next time.